Good day to everybody. Welcome to our second webinar on mapping the benefits of nature, specifically about spatial data in African cities. My name is Ingrid Kutsia, and I am the Senior Program Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions at ICLEI. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all and specifically to this webinar. I'm also going to just very briefly say that we are focusing today on mapping and looking at the growing new field of mapping, not just biodiversity, but specifically also ecosystem services mapping. And will be showcasing several mapping tools and practices around biodiversity mapping and ecosystem services, because these are so critical in understanding our environment and supporting and contributing to human well-being, and specifically also policies and decisions around the use of natural resources in an urban context. So what we're going to be doing today is to have a look at it from a different context, both from a perspective of where we have lots of data to make maps with, but also in those circumstances where we have very little data to make maps with. And our five presenters this afternoon are Fahima Daniels from Sanbi, Cameron McLean from eThekwini, Dr. Shwayab Luasa, who will be joining us shortly from Mikocheni University, Larissa Duma from the World Bank, and she's based in Tanzania, and Joseph Mulders from Prime Africa, based in Johannesburg. And then following those five presentations, we will have a panel ending off our webinar with an interactive panel discussion. And we have four guest panelists. They are Tenda Matagu from the city of Johannesburg. We have Alan Kwanjana from Lilongwe City Council. And then from Kampala City, Capital City Authority, we have Isaac Magmbule. And lastly, but not least, from the GCRO, the Gauteng City region, we have Gillian Marie. Before we start with this very multi-continental panel and discuss presentations, I just want to spell out some house rules. In the first instance, I must just point out to everybody that you are muted during the webinar, and important to understand that we are recording this webinar, and that by participating in the webinar, you give consent to be recorded. We will have a question and answer session directly after the five presentations, and if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question to a specific presenter, we ask that you just include their name so that we know it's maybe for Fahima or Larissa or etc. And then you direct your question so that they will be able to respond to it. We've asked our panelists and our presenters to watch the Q&A box and to respond to questions that are directly directed at them specifically. But we will also, in the panel discussion, once we've given our guest panelists an opportunity to make some statements regarding specific questions that we've asked of them, we will have opportunity to answer more questions from the Q&A box, particularly those that have not yet been answered. And then I think at this stage, we have a very full-packed program, so I'm not going to keep you busy much longer. What I want to do now is just to introduce you to our first speakers. Now, the first three are going to be focusing on mapping in data-rich contexts. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Fahima Daniels. She is the Deputy Director of Biodiversity Planning at Sanbi. And with this, I hand over to you, Fahima.
Thanks, Ingrid. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to be taking you guys through some of the work that we've been doing at the South African National Biodiversity Institute to support mapping and biodiversity planning in South Africa. So yeah, South Africa's had quite a long history of doing what we call systematic biodiversity planning, and I'll explain exactly what that is for those who don't know in a second. So we've got probably dating back to the 50s maps of where our we started mapping our ecosystem types, and we've got really good information for species, especially plants, but that we've obviously ramped up some of the other ecosystem types and species taxonomic groups since then. Next slide, please. Yeah, great. So systematic biodiversity planning, or systematic conservation planning, is what it's really called in the literature. In South Africa, we've chosen to call it systematic biodiversity planning because we're really doing our planning for biodiversity management and not just conservation and protected area expansion, really wanting to identify areas that are important for biodiversity management in general. So pretty much at its basic form, systematic biodiversity planning really encompasses mapping spatially what we have. So that's what we call our biodiversity pattern, so things that you can see, whether those are animals, plants, or ecosystems, so rivers, wetlands, etc., and also our ecological processes. So either mapping it based on expert input or understanding where these processes for ecosystem services and ecological processes that, say, wetlands provide, and mapping those in the landscape. And then we also want to identify how much of those we want, because obviously we can't conserve everything, but how much of each of those ecosystems for our pattern and our process do we need to be able to conserve or manage our biodiversity appropriately. We then use that kind of, and I'm speaking very superficially here, there's a lot of work that goes on in the background, but then we use the ecosystem types, and where these things are in the landscape species, along with the biodiversity targets, and we run them through systematic conservation planning software to determine where our maps of priorities are within a certain area, so whether that's a district or a city or a province. Next slide, please. So there's a few basic, just want to move to the next slide, please. Okay. So at the basic level, there's a couple of data sets that you really need to be able to create these maps of systematic biodiversity planning, systematic biodiversity plans. And what you really need is, as I explained before, is you need to be able to map your ecosystem types, because if you don't know where your ecosystems or your species are in the landscape, you can't pinpoint where your priorities would be. Secondly, you would also need a map of what we call ecological condition. So whether that's land cover or the condition indicating the condition of your rivers or wetlands or marine areas, just so that you know which areas are in the best. So you want to be able to make sure that your biodiversity priorities are in good ecological condition. So for, say, if you've mapped your ecosystems, you want to be able to identify your priorities where they are still in a natural state versus where they've been lost and converted into, say, a mall or a parking lot or a plantation. And then also you need to be able to have a good map of your protected areas. Because we set targets for how much of all of our features we want protected, we want to be able to, so we want to know firstly how much already exists in protected areas, and then use what we call our identified critical biodiversity areas to be able to supplement and complement the features that are already protected in our protected areas. And then lastly, we also want to have targets. So like I said, we want to be able to say how much of each of those ecosystems or species we want to be able to map. So if you just click next on the slides, the rest here. So South Africa's has mapped quite a lot of our ecosystems and features. So we've got national maps of our rivers, wetlands, ecosystems, and our rivers, wetlands, terrestrial ecosystems, and our marine ecosystems. And what we've managed to do in the meantime is, if you just click next slide, the mapping biodiversity priorities map. So what we've also done is we've worked with UNEP WCMC to pull together this document called Mapping Biodiversity Priorities, which really kind of spells out the steps that you need to take and the information, the basic information that is required to be able to create a map of systematic biodiversity plans, and also other kind of information that might help inform biodiversity planning. Next slide, please. So in addition to that, what we also use is in our planning products and in our planning processes are things like our maps of threatened ecosystems and protection levels. So our threatened ecosystems is the maps that we've been able to use our maps for terrestrial, freshwater, marine, etc., and apply the IUCN criteria to map where our threatened ecosystems are, and then also assess and evaluate how well protected these different ecosystem types are. And we use this information as well as our information on like where our biodiversity priorities are through the systematic biodiversity planning process to, if you could go to the next slide, please. Excuse me. So we use all of that information and we pull together both our priorities in terms of where our critical biodiversity areas are, where our existing protected areas are, our threatened ecosystems, our areas that are important for species, and we've been able to create a map of what we call our biodiversity priority areas broadly, and even our freshwater ecosystem priority areas, so a range of different priorities that we've pulled together in what we call our three-way action plan. And it's really a way that we're able to use the same kind of foundational prioritization data sets to influence a range of different things, whether that's reduction, like reducing loss of our ecosystems and species, whether that's informing where our protected areas are and our protected area expansion, or identifying our priorities in terms of restoration. So we're able to pull together quite a data intense suite of data sets to be able to use that same information as a base for doing a lot of the work that we need to do. Next slide, please. And so what being able to have all of this information spatially like really helps us do, if you just click on this slide, then the rest of the, what it really helps us do is it helps when in development applications, so like this would be an EIA application, you're then able to spatially locate yourself in the landscape and then identify what sensitive biodiversity features are present in that site. And currently South Africa also, all of this information feeds into what we call a national environmental screening tool. So every development needs to have a screening report, and all of this information sits in there, and people can identify what features are there and what the steps are that they need to take in order to get an approval for development, or what the features are that are present that they need to take into account in an environmental impact assessment process. We then also, along with just what's there, the screening tool then also speaks to what the different processes are that needs to take place and what other resources they may potentially want to leverage and look at, like as an example is the guidelines. Or whatever guidelines might be important for the features that are present at a specific site and in the decision-making process. The next slide, please. So then we also are able to use our biodiversity planning products in a range of different decision-making tools, which includes influencing the EIA process, but also the spatial development framework, STS, IDP processes that I had mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. And because we're able to identify where these spatial priorities are in the landscape, we're able to make sure that we also then so we work with people that work in, say, the planning speak, to be able to then take the information that we have, and then we help them translate it into what those might be for planning products. So if we know, we look at our CBAs and our ESAs, our critical biodiversity areas, and we're then able to identify which spatial planning categories they might be called in a SDF framework, and then we help them translate that into better planning speak. Next slide, please. So pretty much some of the benefits of spatial biodiversity planning is that there's readily available spatial products that we've been able to produce to help better decision making and planning. So that information is there for people to use and use in their planning process and in the decision making process. It also helps simplify a lot of complex biodiversity data into a set of simple information that can be used in the planning and decision making process. And then spatial data can be easily crosswalked into different processes, particularly in cities, or in different planning processes, and into different products in different and into different tools that cities and the country might be able to use. So that's really how we've been able to use systematic biodiversity planning in South Africa, and probably how it could definitely be used better within cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fahima. That was really interesting, and that was a very informative and whistle-stop tour. I know that you people do amazing work in Sandby, and I'm sure there are going to be several questions. Our next presenter today is Cameron McLean. Cameron is the Senior Specialist Ecologist, Environmental Planning and Climate Protection Department at the City of eThekwini. He's currently also in the post of Acting Senior Manager for the Biodiversity Planning Branch in the same municipality. Cameron, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ingrid, and to Fahima, and generally just to ICLEI for organising this webinar. It's very useful. Next slide, please, Ryan. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. Right, so I'm just going to give some background in terms of Durban's biodiversity, then start looking at the actual mapping that we undertake, and then finally how we integrate that information into the different workflows within our department. Yeah, and the city in general. So for those of you who don't know, Durban is situated on the east coast of South Africa, and I think Fahima's given a really good background in terms of South Africa being a particularly biodiverse country, and Durban is a particularly biodiverse city in that it is situated within one of the 36 global biodiversity hotspots, namely the Maputoland, Pondoland, Albany bioregion. Yeah, and it's characterized obviously by a high level of endemism, and also systems that are under significant threat from transformation, not only urban, but historically agriculture and alike. Yeah, and obviously it's associated with a number of important biophysical and biodiversity features that make the city important from a biodiversity perspective. And there's obviously legal and policy requirements in order to protect these natural assets. Next slide, please, Ryan. So I'm going to start off with our kind of showcase product, and then talk to some of the building blocks that went into its creation. So this is the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System. It's been around since around the 1980s. Obviously changed significantly in terms of how it has been mapped, but also just in terms of spatial extent. The size of the city has increased quite dramatically over the years, including a number of different areas. But at its core, the definition is a series of interconnecting open spaces and public, private, and traditional authority ownership that seek to protect biodiversity and the ecosystem services that they provide. Yeah, in terms of the process of mapping DEMOS, like I mentioned, it has changed quite significantly. Obviously, the improvements in the mapping tools such as GIS has been massive, but also the move, as Fahima was talking about, towards systematic conservation planning. So moving from a expert-based mapping approach to one that's more focused on systematic biodiversity planning. There's obviously been a number of important milestones along the way, but most notably was in 2010, in which DEMOS was included into the hierarchy of plans within municipal planning, land use planning, and specifically within the land use schemes as a development control layer. So what essentially that means is it was moving from the policy space into the implementation space, and it required that any development application that was associated with DEMOS would first have to be approved by local government. So an important step and important emphasis on the mandate of local government to take into consideration environmental planning when it undertakes land use schemes and planning. Next slide, please, Ryan. Yeah, so as Ingrid and Fahima mentioned, some of the inputs that go into these plans. One that has recently been undertaken by Jane Turpey from Anchor Environmental as part of a World Bank commissioned report looking at the valuation of Durban's natural assets from an ecosystem service perspective. It generated some really valuable information across a number of different ecosystem services, and highlighted not only from a spatial planning perspective, but from a narrative point of view, the importance of biodiversity to people, showing that, you know, at a very conservative level, it was valued around 47.8 billion rand, with a flow of 4.2 billion rand per year coming from these different services. One that I found particularly interesting and important was something called amenity value, which in this case was looking at the rates or property taxes that were generated as a result of important natural areas. So for example, a house that is situated right adjacent to a well-maintained nature reserve is obviously going to generate a higher purchase price, and as a result, more property taxes going into the city's coffers versus a property that's maybe a few streets back. And that difference in that value can be attributed directly to the presence of that natural feature. So it offers quite exciting opportunities in terms of closing that loop and taking some of that money from a city perspective and reinvesting in the proactive conservation work. Next slide, please, Ryan. Yeah, I think Fahima touched on it quite nicely, but at the core of every conservation plan, and in this case DEMOS, is a land cover data set or mapping of your ecosystem types. We have got a relatively fine scale land cover map, which we call our land class map, which is done at a scale of 1 in 5,000. And context is everything, and it's really important from a city perspective in order to have this fine scale mapping, because you're making decisions literally at individual urban scale. So yeah, that from our perspective was important, and included in this mapping was obviously the integrated vegetation types, and as well as condition, which allowed us to then use that information in systematic conservation or systematic biodiversity planning. And just to highlight, especially within cities, and it's probably the case of many urban areas, is that you often planning within a low choice planning environment, meaning that when you're trying to meet biodiversity targets in urban areas, it's often very difficult. Much of the area has already been transformed, as you can see from these two maps, which show historically what was present within the city of Durban and what we have now. And it's around a third of what was originally there. Sorry, next slide, Ryan. Thanks. And then obviously all this information ultimately is important in terms of integrating into the various workflows that we have within our departments. There's a number of proactive protected area expansion type work. So identifying, for example, areas that we need to purchase, rezone. Yeah, there's a host of stewardship type initiatives. And then obviously important from our biodiversity impact assessment or our development assessment space. Next slide, please, Ryan. Thanks, Ingrid. Yeah, I'll be another minute. The impact assessment space is obviously probably the most important way in which we use our underlying data. That informs our assessments from whenever there's a development application. And I think its value can be illustrated just purely in numbers. If you look at that map in the center of the screen, those little gray dots are the number of applications that have been received over the last 13 years. And that equates to around 17,000 different applications, from inquiries all the way through to full EIA impact assessment type processes. And invariably that each one of them gets given a significant amount of attention with important biodiversity outcomes. For example, on the right-hand side, where you can see there's been some development allowed in a grassland type system. A conservation servitude has been placed on the remainder of the site, which has obviously been important to securing that corridor in perpetuity. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the platform opportunity.
Thank you so much, Cameron. That was amazing. And it's great to see the practical application on the ground. So some great lessons there from Mikocheni. Our next presenter, who unfortunately was not able to be with us now, and we're hoping that he's going to be joining us a little later, is Dr. Shwaib Luasa. He's Associate Professor from the Department of Geography, Geoinformatics and Climatic Sciences at the Mikocheni University. So we will have a recorded presentation, and I hand over to Ryan to get that going. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleased to be part of the panel to discuss a very important topic on natural assets in cities and decision-making and building resilience in cities in Africa. My name is Shwaib Luasa from Mikocheni University, Department of Geography, and I'm representing colleagues with whom we did work on this, Enoch as well as Benon. The main objective of this work we did on urban natural assets is twofold. One was to inventory the urban assets in Kampala city region and see how the assets could be informing or could inform local government decision making around ecosystem services, as well as related to river and other blue infrastructure systems existing within the city. And we also were aiming at enabling or kickstarting the process of enabling coordination between policymakers and community-based activities for building sustainability and resilience, which would also imply working around the persistent poverty situation, taking advantage of the natural assets within Kampala. So that was the main objective of this initiative. And if you could switch to the next slide, the approach in inventorying the natural assets in city involved a decision on the sources of information or data, and we decided to utilize satellite imagery, high resolution satellite imagery, and decided on the level of mapping to be patch level and not species, from which we could build a mosaic and then try to characterize the landscape. So we developed a mapping classes and generate attribute information that we would be capturing data on in consultation with stakeholders, that is Kampala Capital City Authority, as well as cities around the city region. And then we classified the image and conducted a hotspot analysis. The next slide shows you the hotspot, the participatory approach we also employed with the Kampala Capital City Authority stakeholders within the administration decision-making, but also other cities around the city region, municipalities like Nansana, Entebbe, Machindi, Sabagabo. We did employ a participatory approach, and we held several workshops to help us clarify the natural assets, but also get insights into how we can improve the mapping, and then later analyze that in a geospatial environment. And the next slide shows you the activities that we employed in the process. We satellite imaged 2 images, one of 2010 and one of 2014, both of which were mosaics on high resolution, 0.5 meter resolution, which gives quite dense and we utilize survey tools, the GPS, and as well as some kind of photographs to capture the information, especially about the priorities. The city authorities prioritize bees and birds as some of the fauna that is important for the city. And the next slide shows that the indicators of the images that we analyzed 2010 as well as 2014. So the patch level, at patch level, we characterized woodlots, broad canopy trees, swamp forests, swamp papyrus, water, hedge, green, and we analyzed that also for 2014. We crossed the images and analyzed the loss and gain of the natural assets. And in the next slide, we show the criteria used in hotspot analysis, and those criteria on the left is connectivity of the patches, closeness and distance to other land uses, patch conditions, are they intact or not, neighboring land use to show the threat, and then we did some kind of ranking of biodiversity richness and noticeable ecosystems change. And in the next slide, we start to show the outputs and outcomes. So we eventually yielded a stock of urban natural assets in the city region. And then we also went through a process of linking this information to land use planning and environmental planning, with also an aim of getting in-depth understanding of how that can be integrated in decision-making processes to improve coordination between stakeholders as well as community activation. And some of the results in the next slide starting to come through there. Generally, in the city region, before that map is an indication of the natural asset conditions in the city region. The current map you see on the slide is the Kampala Capital City Authority area, but with some few areas added on, which are functionally and highly urbanized. The legend can guide you there, but you can see just patches left within the city area that are forest or grassland, majority of which are hedges. And the level of degradation is also high within the city area. Again, there are few areas that are less degraded around the edges of the city area, and these need some kind of better management, if not protection. And the next slide shows you the hotspot areas. Red are the hotspot areas in terms of natural assets and level of degradation. Yellow is in medium level of degradation, and white you see as white is urbanized, so there isn't much in terms of natural assets within the city. But you can also notice that there are some small patches scattered around the city region that are green with the low level of hotspot. If you zoom into KCC area, again we see a few patches that are exposed to threat with natural assets around the edge of Kampala Capital City Authority, but much of Kampala is very much a hotspot in terms of natural assets degradation. Now, linking the natural assets to decision making as well as land use planning, this work came at a time when we had already done some work around new ways of planning, land use planning that integrates nature into the city. And this slide just shows you the importance of linking blue, green, human capital, and gray. And the key question is how to balance that in order to enhance ecosystem services, but still provide livable and good well-being of environment, as well as enabling activities that could alleviate poverty within the city. So multi-objective urban planning would also imply that you need to integrate risk reduction into land use planning. So this is the insights that I wanted to share with you in this webinar in terms of benefits of mapping natural assets in cities and building resilience and enhancing ecosystem service, but also addressing persistent poverty in the cities. And I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. Our next speakers are going to be focusing on mapping in data poor contexts. And while we get them ready, I just want to remind people, please, we have some questions, but we would like to have a lot more questions so that we can have a really lively panel discussion. So feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box. Right, so I'm going to be now presenting Larissa Duba. She's from the World Bank. She's based in Tanzania, and she's an urban ecology and resilience specialist. And over to you, Larissa.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So thanks, everyone. I am here today to give you a brief introduction to some of the mapping work that we are doing, like just a snapshot on urban tree and remote canopy mapping in Tanzania as well as Sierra Leone. Next slide. So diving right into this, I would like to quickly talk about urban tree mapping, harnessing students and graduates to map urban forests and trees. Next slide, please. So what is our aim? We are working on developing a replicable, open source and cost-effective workflow for mapping trees and establishing and managing an urban tree database, with the greater aim to be able to support urban centers in tracking and quantifying greening efforts, particularly right now supporting Freetown in Sierra Leone, which has a massive urban greening project going on called Freetown the Tree Town, where within the next year they aim to plant 1 million or over 1 million trees, as well as Dar es Salaam and Morogoro, both based in Tanzania. So how does this process look? What are we working with? So typically we begin this process by doing a data use brainstorming session to identify different potential data users, which leads to a series of questions and content that we want to collect on each individual tree, so that the tree is linked to a series of attributes that can be used for future management. Then we input this into developing an ODK survey, so Open Data Kit survey, and work with a group of, in our case, we were working with a group of graduate mappers, where we trained them on the mapping survey, as well as calibrated their phones to take photos of certain images, which I'll get into in a moment, which allow us to do some post-processing of these images to determine the heights of different trees. After going out and conducting all the field work, then we sit with the team and we work on some post-processing, and in particular we've been working on a really unique tree height post-processing measurement system, as well as in the coming months we're going to be working on tree species ID. So next slide please. So just giving you a bit of a sample for future reference of some of the data that we were collecting for our pilot project in Dar es Salaam. This list here is quite comprehensive, but due to time, I won't dive into it. But for all trees that were greater than 1.5 meters high, one example of something that might be interesting for urban forestry management is point number 4. So we were trying to identify, and we had a different proxy used, or a more specific proxy used during the time, to identify what trees were nearby. So for example, if we went out to a field, we tagged an individual tree, the location of that tree, and all of these data points. Is that tree near electricity wires or other wires? Is it nearby a roadway? And with training with the students and or recent graduates and a little bit of post-analysis, this can help to inform some decision-making on tree management. Maybe the tree needs pruning. Maybe it needs to be, the roots need to be adjusted. Maybe something needs to happen in order to manage it within that space. So this is just a sample of the data that we had collected for larger trees, larger than 1.5 meters in our pilot. Next slide. So what did this process look like? As you can see in the top left-hand corner, that was part of our brainstorming session on potential data uses. Which then got translated into a file that you see on the bottom left and then put into the ODK survey on the right. Next slide. And in partnership, I have on the top left-hand side here, you'll see an image of the Green Stand app. So that's one of our partners that we are working with here, whereby they have a tree tracking platform, an open source tree tracking platform. So we partnered with them to use their existing platform as both a data storage mechanism in our case, but also a visualization platform for all the trees that we piloted in this case. So you'll see all these orange dots represents almost 500 trees that were mapped just before COVID, when we unfortunately were unable to continue the next field mapping session in Dar es Salaam to test out this methodology. So one interesting observation talking about post-processing is the tree on the right side. You'll see that red pole on the bottom of the tree, and that is designed so that we can do some post-processing on height. So jumping ahead, next slide, please. So remote canopy mapping. This process is designed to use artificial intelligence to detect and monitor urban forest canopy for Freetown and Dar es Salaam. Next slide. So our aim for this was to develop a replicable workflow for monitoring urban tree canopy, which also allows us to track and quantify greening efforts in Freetown in Sierra Leone, as well as baseline survey for Dar. And being cognizant of the time, I'm going to run through this quick. So the how. Using satellite imagery and local mappers, we develop training data, which is fed into an AI model. And once the model is trained, we can use that to develop a greening baseline. Next slide. What this looks like in practice, on the bottom left-hand side, you'll see some squiggly lines that were drawn over top of the tree canopy. So that was my best attempt to show what it's like as a mapper to quickly trace over an entire canopy area. This type of information is then fed, as you can see in the right top right corner, into the AI model. And the output is what you see in the bottom right corner, which shows the different canopy cover. Next slide, please. So one of the aims of this, as you can see by this slide, is to show changes over time of canopy cover. So on the left-hand side, fully forested, and as urbanization and development changes, you can see the changes in canopy cover. Next slide. So without getting into much detail, I listed here a series of potential use cases for this type of data, inclusive of urban forest management, such as tree pruning, cutting, growing, and more, but also informing things such as infrastructure management, climate change mitigation and adaptation planning, green infrastructure planning and implementation. Also some of the stuff that was spoken about in previous presentations, just about general urban planning, EIAs, utilities, planning and management, etc. So these are some of the use cases that we anticipate to have with some of this data, and we hope to be able to roll them out for other urban spaces. So thank you very much. Last slide. Thank you very much for the presentation, and yeah, back to you, Ingrid.
Great, thank you so much for that, Larissa. It looks really exciting. And without any further ado, our next presenter is Joe Mulders, and Joe is going to talk about his mapping experience. He's a systems ecologist and he works for Prime Africa. Thanks, Joe. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, and thank you, Italy, for the invite and being able to come through and have a good chat. I'm going to give you a few details on a project we completed in 2018. It was a project facilitated by Italy and funded through USAID. And the project was entitled Gap Analysis, Baseline Resource Assessment, and High-Level Mapping of Wetlands in the West Rand District Municipality. Next slide. So for those of you who don't know, the West Rand is on the western side of Gauteng. It's about 440,000 hectares. It's about 25% of Gauteng. The region is heavily transformed through extensive land use development. There's loads of mining activities in the area, and of course, being Gauteng, high urbanization and urban sprawl. As a result, land transformation has already heavily impacted on the natural ecosystems in the district. And the West Rand District Municipality identified their lack of spatial data, specifically to aquatic ecosystems, as a primary limitation to sustainable management of their natural resources. The lack of this data meant it's nearly impossible to make meaningful and informed management decisions going forward, which directly threatens the existing ecological infrastructure and natural capital. So that's when we came in to conduct a gap analysis of all possible resources and desktop level identification of wetlands in the municipality. So our approach was stepwise as followed. Firstly, we identified and sourced all possible data and sources of data through the literature and stakeholder consultations. Then we validated that data based on metadata and again, stakeholder consultations. And I will skip the details of these first two steps. I think we're more interested in the last two. Then we moved on to the creation of new primary data and finally the classification of a spatial output. Obviously, throughout this process, we worked very closely with the West Rand, all of the colleagues there, making sure we had a meaningful output. Next slide. So this map shows the results of the first two steps. It has one provincial input, which is the rivers, and two national inputs. It wasn't a very extensive spatial map. It was about 12,000 hectares of aquatic resources extent. Although this was already it was a good step forward in terms of having spatial data for the area. You know, we could immediately see that there was a vast underestimation of natural capital on the ground. We needed to start looking into some form of high-level delineation and creation of primary data. We knew at the time that SANBI and the CSIR were busy reviewing the latest national wetland layer, which was Wetland Map 5, so we contacted them. And it turns out they were about to publish the draft guidelines to mapping wetlands in South Africa. A fantastic document, which really goes through the process of mapping wetlands. You can click onto the next. The guideline outlines best practices, approaches, protocols, tools, and procedures for producing a robust spatial output at a variety of scales. Our focus was Part A and Part B to conduct a desktop delineation of the wetlands. We also committed to following other complementary protocols which were available so that our outputs could actually be included in the updated national wetland map. Next slide. So the process required three broad steps, and I'm shortening this for the sake of the presentation, but step one, preparation of guiding layers, including digital elevation, contours, watershed boundaries, that sort of thing. Step 2 was delineation of wetland boundaries using Google Earth, basically, across various years and various scales. And step 3 was the classification of wetland features based on their locality, on existing data that we knew. So things like threat level, ecoregion, wetland vegetation type, that sort of thing. Next slide. Now, as I said, for the sake of a short presentation, I've spared a lot of the details, but the resulting output is shown here. Although it does not look that impressive, this layer represents a comprehensive desktop delineated wetland output, which is representing a really powerful tool for natural resource management in the area. The municipality was extremely happy with the results. You know, before this, they didn't actually have an idea of how many of the wetland extent they had in the region, and now it's, in terms of mapping representation, it's in the order of 40,000 hectares, so it's about 10% of the region. So now they have a platform from where they can make meaningful management decisions. So next slide. For the purposes of use in the municipality, we went one step further. They needed a layer that could inform a red light or green light type system where municipal decision makers across the district could flag potential threats to aquatic resources. So we consolidated that initial layer into a single layer and applied various buffers at 32 meters and 500 meters. It was going to become it's to be used as a regulatory tool to guide requirements by environmental authorization process, basically again in the EIA process. It became almost a hotspot layer. Very similar to wetland inventory layers that you have in the city of Joburg and Ekurhuleni. Next slide. So we developed a terms of use layer, basically, and a tool so that, for example, if a development fell into a 500-meter regulatory buffer, it would have a medium probability of aquatic ecosystem presence and trigger specific requirements by the applicant in line with legislation, obviously. And we handed this over to the municipality for further development. Next slide. So out of this process, we had 3 key outputs. The first was the desktop delineated wetlands data set. That was the detailed one. And that was actually obviously handed over to the municipality, but also it became an input for wetland map 5. The second was the aquatic ecosystem probability data set, which was for use in the environmental authorization process by municipal officers. And finally, we prioritized management units of the wetlands based on threat, pressures, that sort of thing. And we handed that over to the municipality for management purposes. Next slide. So what did we learn? I think before we started this process, we were a little bit nervous in terms of what we'd be able to do, but it turns out there are fantastic tools out there that you can use when there's no data. You know, consolidating everything can get you this far, but using tools like Google Earth, it seems so simple, but obviously it has its limitations. There are limitations, it's desktop, but it's a fantastic tool to use, and there are guidelines out there that guide the use of these tools. Output development with the end user is obviously very important. We want to make sure that we can align whatever we produce with whoever the user of that information is. And I think I will stop there. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Joe. That's been really interesting. We've got some really great questions, and I'm going to pose some of them. I see that some of you have responded to questions directed to you individually, but there's an interesting question that I want to put open to the floor, and that is, how does one deal with situations where when you're mapping and the sort of ecosystem has been affected or impacted upon by either fires or climate change, etc. How does one accommodate that within a mapping scenario and a mapping perspective? Anybody that's wanting to respond to that, that would be both in terms of planned but also existing mapping exercises. Anybody that's prepared to respond to that question?
I think I could come in really quickly, Ingrid, on
Thanks, Larissa.
On changes. I mean, only from the Canapy cover perspective, I could I could suggest that from the canopy cover perspective, once the baseline map has been conducted, the AI model is quite rapid and it can rapidly be run through again once you have the imagery change. So as long as the satellite imagery change has captured, you know, the fire or flooding or other event, then you'd be able to run that through quite rapidly. But
okay,
I say from other perspectives, it may need another set of analysis.
Yeah. Anybody else who's had some experience in this, or maybe some ideas to put into the pot here?
Ingrid, can I also just add
Yes.
that for us, when we're doing, say, vegetation mapping, we don't just look at a snapshot image. So we would look at like other, like kind of backcast into different, for that same area in like back in time,
Okay.
in like different time series, to also then be able to infer whether what that ecosystem type might have looked like in the past. And in fact, for our vegetation maps in general, we try and make sure that at the very least that things like fires and like clearing of vegetation doesn't really affect the fact that it still is that vegetation type. So we map what we call the original extent of the ecosystem. When it comes to climate change, though, that gets very tricky, because climate change obviously happens over a longer time period, and there are going to be things like where bush encroachment or species change happens. And so we're still trying to figure out how we deal with that in our vegetation map, and how we decide when something moves from one ecosystem type to another based on the state that it is, and whether that's a permanent change or whether it's just something that's a snapshot in time. Like if it's a fire, it's just for now, and in like a few years it'll recover. But something like a climate change, bush encroachment change is a little bit different. So that is still something we're working with.
Okay, great. We have a question that is specifically directed at Cameron. This is somebody who's based in Uganda, where they have an environmental policy, which is also a local policy, and says that if you cut down a tree, you also have to plant at least 2 trees. And this person has seen many investments coming into Africa, and trees are cut down and uprooted, and municipalities and towns are thinking about planting more trees, and he's wondering about he says you specifically talked about ecosystem mapping and interconnectivity, the whole issue of interconnectivity. How do you see the role of mapping when it comes to peri-urban development being a shield for cities and towns in Africa, and to protect, or sort of, let's say, enhance and secure connectivity and corridors and things? Thanks, Cameron.
Sorry, Ingrid, I lost audio there for a long time, so I literally only caught the tail end of that, so I didn't get the actual question.
Okay, so the question is about how where you've got development in cities, and there's a lot of vegetation that's being cut down for development, and part of one's ecosystem and mapping is around looking at things like connectivity and corridors. How do you address that, particularly insofar as developments around the sort of built-up urban areas and city areas, so that those urban areas, or the peri-urban areas, can become shields for cities and towns within an African context?
Sure, okay. So I'll just start on and kind of building off the previous question on how the mapping actually takes place, is that it's typically in response to additional or new aerial photography that takes place. And then it comes down to, there's 2 aspects. There's obviously the kind of legal formal development that's taking place through the normal city processes, land use processes. And then there's the kind of gradual creep, informal nature that's not necessarily controlled to the same level. That becomes slightly more difficult, but certainly the looking at corridors and such things is taken into consideration during the assessment process, and is a big part of the comments that are provided through those land use planning processes. So if that helps.
Thanks, that certainly does. And then here's just a general question, which I think is great, and I'm open to anybody. Looking at the future of ecosystem services in the global rush on the so-called green economy and green recovery, How do you, as presenters and experts talking here, what do you feel are the mapping gaps insofar as supporting green recovery? Any offers on that one? In a sense, this is a question that's looking forward and how mapping can support green recovery.
Hi, Ingrid.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. The first speaker, who was that? I can't see here on my screen.
Joe Mulders.
Yes. Okay, Joe, go ahead.
I think we can go very far in terms of spatial mapping and actually looking at where our natural capital is in our green infrastructure. But I think, you know, when looking at ecosystem services and that sort of thing, understanding the reach of services in terms of impact, in terms of who the beneficiaries are, is that at a local level, is that at a regional level, or maybe even an international level? I think that sort of connection between ecological infrastructure or ecosystems on the ground and the direct and indirect beneficiaries, I think that's something major that I think we'll see start developing over the next couple of years. But I would say that's a major gap.
Okay, thanks. And maybe just one last, I think it was Fahima, you were trying to say something. If you want to say a few things before we move on to the next part of our program.
Sorry, no, Ingrid, it wasn't me.
Oh, was it Larissa then maybe?
Apologies, it was me.
Okay, great. Larissa, go for it.
No problem. I suppose just kind of correlating it to an existing project that's taking place in Freetown in Sierra Leone. So what we're seeing now is that the baseline mapping that is being conducted intends to feed directly into, of course, a monitoring and evaluation system for some of the greening measures that are going on. And I think it's the starting point in this case for a series of analytics into ecosystem services, and as Joseph alluded to, identification of how those services are directly impacting individuals and beneficiaries and communities. And in this context, it's actually hoping to link and quantify a bit in the disaster risk reduction and management space. So the idea is hopefully we can quantify over time a reduction in some of the soil erosion issues and sedimentation issues which are causing flooding in Freetown, in the greater Freetown area. So I think it's kind of the starting point, and we're not really sure where it goes yet, but we're hoping that this data will feed into that.
Okay. Great, thank you. I think we need to move on to the next part because we're going to run out. Question time is always such an interesting thing, but we do have 4 guest panelists, and I would certainly like to extend a warm welcome now to Tenda Matago from the city of Johannesburg, Alan Konjana from Lilongwe, Isaac Mbule from Kampala, and Gillian Marie from the Gauteng City region. So I'm going to kick off with some questions to just stimulate a discussion amongst our panelists, but also our speakers, and maybe some further questions from the floor. And I'm going to ask Gillian, first of all, what impact has the GCRO's mapping had on decision-making and priority setting in the Gauteng City region? We've had a few questions coming up from the attendees that sort of touches on this, so I think it's a very apt question. Thanks, Gillian, and over to you for a response.
Thank you, Ingrid. A very apt question, but a very tricky question to understand always. I think our approach to it always has been framing the work that we do in the space as green infrastructure. So yeah, we specifically look at the intersection of these natural assets and our ecological systems, both natural and constructed. Remember, in the Gauteng City region, we work in a very large, rapidly growing urban city region. So it's important that we consider all of these green spaces, landscape features, natural, and sometimes created spaces, along with the services and functions that they create, and see how it relates both to traditional infrastructure as well. And that allows us a framework of being able to show how these assets work together. And it starts talking to what a lot of the previous presentations were also alluding to, is that the importance of being able to connect the language to what we see coming from policymakers, from urban land use makers. So it connects that. We're able to connect it to how people see asset registers, you know, and traditional ways of thinking of infrastructure. So it becomes easier to facilitate that level of language. And a final point I want to make, I think, is it's important that we emphasize as well that a lot of what we're talking about, the language is new, the science is new, the data is always changing, but that doesn't mean these interventions are always new. And in many cases, we try and pick up case studies in this part of the world where developers, land use planners have already embraced nature-based solutions. So where there has been consideration of, for example, wetlands in determining floodlines and in putting stormwater plans in place, to try and highlight that as much as the science is new and is changing and we're embracing it, but many of the concepts is stuff that cities have been tackling before, so that it's not something that's coming, you know, sometimes completely left field. That sometimes, wait, I don't know if I'm being quite clear here, but often the perception is the ideas around nature-based solutions is that it's completely new, and it isn't. Cities have been doing these things maybe even in an ad hoc way in the past. And so what we're asking for people is not a complete switch and change to the way that we're doing things, but rather embracing and tweaking as you go along.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Thank you. That's actually a good point to end, and it also ties up actually nicely with the presentations that we had in our webinar last week, where this thing about nature-based solutions and the fact that we've been actually using them for long, but just not labeling them as such. And this leads very nicely to our next question, to Isaac, who is from Kampala, as I said earlier. And we're wanting to know from you, Isaac, to what extent has biodiversity mapping informed development and land use planning instruments in the city of Kampala? So, you know, what is the uptake? And if you can just, in a very brief, in a snapshot, in a few minutes, just give us a response to that question, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ingrid. So as the city of Kampala, we've gone the extra mile to actually map the sort of species, especially within the urban forestry. So as we saw from the previous presentation with Dr. Swipe, that the green vegetation within the city center is has been absorbed and is non-existent. So we went further to map to understand the tree population we have within the city. And we were able to, surprising results, that we were able to map over 53,000 trees within the city in 4 precincts. And within that, we found over 328 tree species that did exist. But we also, to inform our planning process, we also needed to identify of these trees, what are the protected tree species that we have within the city. And that then better informed us that when it comes to infrastructure projects, if you have protected tree species, that these projects have to be directed elsewhere. The other information also allowed us to develop, we're currently in the process of developing our first urban green infrastructure ordinance that looks at the population that is allowed per each plot of land. So when you look at tree densities, because we found, for example, that in recreation land use, we have a tree density of 161 trees per acre. And then when it comes to wetlands and industrial areas, we have a tree population, a density of 2 trees per acre. Now that then highlighted the need for us to, if we protect elements like the wetlands, that sort of land uses like recreation activities do allow for they do encourage the growing of such tree species. But we also want to move further and need to develop a system that allows us to periodically map these spaces so that we can assess the impact of some of our interventions or lack thereof. So as we're moving forward as a city, previously our planning did not require the understanding of green infrastructure, but we are now embarking on developing a green infrastructure master plan that will now allow us to link not just the green spaces, but also understand the corridors and the sort of vegetation that does exist within such corridors. So in terms of mapping, this has informed our political leaders. They've actually gained an appreciation of what it is, what trees are, but we have also even developed an online tree database, because to appreciate these trees, it doesn't have to be within the scientific community. We need to allow the citizens to appreciate these trees. So we have developed an online tree database that gives the local name of the tree species, the location, so people can actually identify and understand the use of these trees. So yeah, that's what we're doing.
Thank you so much. That's great. And actually, you've answered one or two of the questions that were in the Q&A box. So that's a double. That's been great. All right. Our next question. No, that's great news. Thanks, Isaac. Our next question goes to Tenda. So Tenda, Gillian actually referred to this issue of language and planning and mapping, etc. And the question I want to ask you is whether, well, we know there is a difference in the language that's used by ecologists on the one hand and planners on the other. And just from your own experience in the city of Johannesburg, how has this affected the interpretation and the usefulness of biodiversity maps for land use planning purposes? Just a few minutes. Thanks, Tanda.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. Ecologists and planners mostly work in different areas of interest, and that can be a bit challenging. But however, we both use terms like land use cover, land use patterns, and we also look at different kind of changes. Unfortunately, these have got different meanings to us. For example, ecologists actually we detect structures and we actually want to see how we can conserve. While planners, in most instances, when they look at a place, they actually see an area on which they can put structures. In most instances, of course, this is a gross generalization. For example, when you engage with planners, you can find that sometimes you are talking about an open space of land. To a planner, that can look as vacant land, but an ecologist might see an opportunity to conserve. So when a land is seen as vacant, planners might see it as not being optimally utilized, and that can actually trigger intentions to plan for structures, infrastructure. And that becomes very challenging when it comes to places like the city of Johannesburg, where it is the smallest, Gauteng is the smallest province in the country. COJ is densely populated, so they are competing land uses. So fortunately, I must say that working with our planners, they've been very helpful to us, and we, to a most degree, speaking the same language. But this was mainly informed by the fact that the city of Johannesburg has a 2040 growth and development strategy. This strategy emphasizes the need for a compact city. It talks about reduction of ecological footprints. It talks about avoidance of urban sprawl, with development actually encouraged within the urban boundary. The strategy goes further to talk about environmental protection and climate change, and that actually assists us because it helps us as the city in its totality to sing from the same hymn page. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tenda. Our last but not least question goes to Alan, and just to ask him, what are the specific challenges in applying biodiversity maps in your city of Lilongwe? Just a brief response to that, please, Alan. Thank you. And then we'll go into some more general question time again.
The challenges that we have faced ourselves in Lilongwe here, starting from those from authorities, be they land authorities or political authorities, especially when it comes to compromise. Sometimes they would want to compromise the land use for what they would call an equally important land use. So we don't speak, we find ourselves that we are not speaking the same language as the ecologists have put it. At times we have got those challenges. Of course, with the various stakeholders also, our city being in the sub-Saharan Africa, you would find that these environmentally sensitive areas that require to be protected also contain resources which some people would want to use. Things like they would want to be growing, doing some agricultural activities within the protected areas, or collecting firewood, or getting some resources for survival and livelihoods. Now, after we have indicated that these areas are supposed to be areas that should be taken care of, that should be protected environmentally, you find that there's a lot of conflict with the stakeholders in general. So there's need for sensitization and of course, people to understand what we are talking about. Again, lastly, the users of the biodiversity NGOs who work, when we give them, there's still a challenge of capacity in interpreting the maps and how to best to make best use of them. So we feel these are the challenges that require to be addressed if the use of biodiversity maps is to be a success in the development of our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Alan. We've got a steady flow of questions. Some of them are quite specific. And just to let everybody know, we will, if we have questions that are not answered, we have agreed with our panelists and our speakers today that where there are questions specifically directed to them, they would provide us with a short response, and we will capture that in a Word document, and we will then disseminate that after the webinar. But I have a very interesting question here that I think we can open up to the floor. And it relates to infrastructure development in our cities. And the question is, so with all the backlogs and the need for new infrastructure development and all the talk around green and blue, etc. infrastructure, what sustainable strategy can our governments use to conserve specifically biodiversity, which is being affected by infrastructure, particularly in areas where we have very little or no biodiversities, to try and protect the little that we still have. I don't know if who wants to start with responding to that. I know it's a problem that many of you have grappled with, particularly those of you that work in rapidly growing cities. So anybody wanting to respond to that question?
Hi, Ingrid.
Yes, I was hoping you would. Thank you.
Okay. No, as I've already alluded, in the state of Johannesburg, we've got our growth and development strategy. So what has been happening over the years is that some areas which have already been developed, the old part of the city have been identified as corridors of freedom. By so doing, those corridors are actually being developed in such a way that they're actually dense, in such a way that there's transport, instead of avoiding developing other small cities far away from the major urban area. The old city sections are being densified, provided with amenities in such a way that our city becomes compact. I think that's what we're doing as a city, just to compact our city as much as possible, not to have sprawling.
Thanks. And I'm wondering, Isaac, I think you mentioned that you've also got a green infrastructure strategy, or in the process of developing one. Would you like to respond as well? Unmute yourself.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So we did discover that when we were developing master plans, they developed the drainage master plan, they developed the transport master plan, and there was a lack of a green infrastructure master plan. So we felt that because we look at most of these corridors, that, for example, in our tree audit, our emphasis was on the on the gray corridors where the roads pass, because that's where we're facing the biggest loss of trees. So we then are proposing that by we having this layer of green and linking these spaces, because much as we look at the roads as development that is cutting away our green infrastructure, but it's also providing that linkage between these spaces. So the emphasis is when we acquire corridors for a road, that we add more space to allow for the greening and the trees that will be planted along these corridors. So in that way, we're hoping that when we develop this green infrastructure master plan, that we change the classification of roads, that as opposed to you classifying the roads based on the traffic, we classify it based on the tree canopy or the tree density along such corridors. So that is the move that we're currently engaging together with our engineering partners as we're moving forward in this project.
Great, thanks. I'm wondering, Gillian, if you've got anything to say. I know that the GCRO has done amazing work in the field of green infrastructure mapping and research, etc. I don't know if you've got any lessons or some advice that you would like to share today with us.
I don't know, it's so much if it's lessons learned, but maybe some reflections on our recent work. So our most recent report on green infrastructure in the Gauteng city region looked particularly at how do we get green infrastructure into more traditional modes of infrastructure planning. So what are the options of getting green infrastructure into an asset register, for example? How do we get it into planning processes? And the reality for biodiversity specialists is that we need to understand and we need to be able to translate why that biodiversity matters. So we as scientists might understand, you know, the ecological service value or the ecosystem value, but we need to be able to connect it back to the city amenity value. And some of the presentations we've heard today have really done that nicely. And we then need to, and that's the language we then need to be able to connect back into infrastructure planning. One of the ways that's been processed and proposed in the past is how do we get green servitudes? So just as we have a servitude for a road or electricity, and this talks very much, I think, to a lot of the work that Mikocheni has done in their metropolitan open system, is that we start connecting infrastructure to space requirements as well. And then it starts talking planning language, it starts talking engineering language, and it becomes easier to count it as an asset and get it into city resources and planning. It does require quite a bit of work though, so it's easier said. It's easy for me to say as a researcher. It requires a real level of skill from many of the presenters today that actually sit within municipalities doing this work.
Yeah, I think you raise a very interesting point, and I actually want to ask Cameron if he would be willing, and then maybe after him, Alan, we're willing to talk a little bit more about this. How do we translate, how do we interpret, what's the value and the significance of biodiversity, specifically when we're looking at, you talked about city amenity value. So where you are based in your cities, how do you bridge that gap?
Right, thanks, thanks Ingrid. I think the messaging is so important, and adapting the messaging is also really important. We've seen over, as DEMOS, for example, has evolved, our open space system has evolved, we've often changed the messaging to suit what is out there, or the perceptions that are out there at the time. So, for example, in like the 90s, sustainable development was a big thing. Then ecosystem services came on board, and and then obviously systematic conservation planning and sustainable development goals and the whole host of them. And it's about identifying those policy windows as well, and trying to take advantage of them in terms of your messaging within the city. I think that's quite a critical one from our side in terms of how we've managed to integrate some of our work. I think that point around the asset register is a hugely powerful one. When you start talking about green, natural in that context, that sits very far more comfortably with your planners, your engineers, and alike than the typical biodiversity narrative. So I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of getting that message right, even within Mikocheni. So it's quite encouraging to hear that that's such an advanced narrative in other parts of the country. yeah, but so my message around that would just be around adapting your narrative of how you giving that biodiversity message constantly, and just reflecting on, is it currently the best way to do it, and are there better options to get that message across? Thanks.
Thank you. Alan, any reflections from your side on this, taking this topic a little further? Alan? Might have a... Okay, I think Alan is struggling he seems to have been frozen. Maybe we can take this discussion. Alan, are you with us? You just muted. You need to unmute yourself. There you are. Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
You can hear me now.
Yes,
yeah,
now we can hear you.
I was saying in our city, our main challenge of stakeholder conflicts, we are trying to make sure that planners, environmentalists, and engineers, we should be speaking one language. All professionals should be on board when it comes to biodiversity conservation. We should be planning together for whatever development that is taking place. As for the general public and stakeholders, we are trying to sensitize and make people be aware of the importance of biodiversity conservation, and at the same time trying to enforce the bylaws that go along with the biodiversity conservation, because there is a lot of conflict. Some people have got better reasons in terms of livelihood and survival when it comes to these issues. So sometimes our mandate has been questioned, even in courts, about certain actions that we take. So we would like to strengthen that, so that from the authorities to everybody within our city, we should be able to appreciate and work cooperatively in order to promote biodiversity conservation in the city.
Thanks, Alan. And that actually leads me on to another very interesting thing, and we've had some questions around that. And that's the question of, you talked about livelihoods, but there's also been some questions around ecosystem services that are linked specifically to cultural services and values, and how these are incorporated in mapping. And maybe it's an idea here to bring Fahima and Larissa. So before we look a little bit wider in terms of how it's done at the national scale, Fahima, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you're willing to say something, I know that Sanbi's done some amazing work around messaging, and I'm sure you're going to have something to say. And then once you've done, maybe Larissa, over to you. Fahima.
Sure, thanks, Ingrid. I was also just going to add that Sanbi has, not just Sanbi, but I guess the biodiversity sector in South Africa has also kind of made that move to trying to connect with engineers and planners, and have kind of started using the phrase ecological infrastructure, and not just working with biodiversity priorities. So really making a point to try and map and identify some of these features. And in some cases, these might not be biodiversity priorities, but they are very definitely like nature-based, like natural ecosystems or natural features that provide a service to people. And so that's very important for us to also map and manage and make sure that these wetlands that are important for water security, water provision, water just kind of treating water, that those ecosystems are both managed to be able to make sure that they stay in good condition, and prioritized for rehabilitation. So where communities rely on these areas to do things like have them as cultural spaces. So we have noted that these are obviously also very important in terms of the ecosystem services, and we haven't managed to map them properly, or at least they are identified as features that we do want to include in our conservation planning efforts. Because so if we can bring people along with and getting people to see the value in these people already see the value in these ecosystems where we value them as well, and then map them and then are able to manage them and prioritize them, that makes quite a big difference in the way that we're able to engage with local communities, etc. So we have made big strides in trying to identify things like forests that are important for cultural areas and map those and have those included in our priorities. Like in the Eastern Cape, those have now been incorporated into both the biodiversity priorities and the cultural priorities, so that we can work together to make sure that these areas are conserved or managed well into the future. Yeah.
Thanks. And Larissa, before you respond, I see there was a question that specifically wanting to know from you why the World Bank focused on trees. What about other species, particularly the smaller ones that are just as important as trees? And somebody else also wanted to know about to what extent mangroves in Dal were being mapped. So over to you.
Thank you. And I'm really glad you mentioned that. I was going to actually tie that into my answer. So
all right, great.
So perfect. So when it comes to some of the cultural components, so let me address it in two different segments. So when you look at individual tree mapping, for example, that is a lot of the brains data that we were trying to collect on individual tree mapping included some of the non-conventional use cases. So if for those that are going to look back at the slides later, you'll see this nearby category and you'll see people. Now that's very vague because in the survey, we didn't want to put all this information, but with training with the mappers themselves, people in this case meant do people use this tree as shade to sell something? Are they sitting beneath the tree and using it as some sort of, because that's a very common thing in Dar es Salaam, it becomes your local little shop is underneath the tree, like a vendor location, or are they using the tree as a space for community meetings, which is very, very common again in this urban space, or are they using these types of things? So in the individual tree mapping, when it comes to cultural services that trees are providing, that category was there, as well as the other category where you could input that data individually. So you could say, yes, this was like a very important tree within the community because this one is the meeting place for all of the local meetings at the sub-ward level, for example. When it comes to the cultural services provided from the lens of a Canapy mapping perspective, I think that we would have to do some interesting post-analysis on that because that has not, first off, this is just being initiated right now and we're mostly trying to test the AI model on this, but I think it would have to link to localized mapping initiatives that are on the ground to really say that these spaces provide certain values for these reasons. I would like to quickly address, yeah, Penelope, I saw your question. I hope I enunciated that correctly about the why trees. So I think given the context that we're in right now, both in Sierra Leone as well as Dar es Salaam, we're kind of in a disaster risk management and reduction perspective in space. And at the moment, when it comes to communicating both with local government authorities, as well as communicating with communities and the Dar City Council and urban planners, et cetera, the narrative is maybe, it would be a bit ahead of us at this moment in time to talk about grasses and wetlands. We are trying. It's something that we're looking at in one of the floodplains where we're having quite a few, several times a year, flooding events in one of the river basins, for example. And that can be definitely attributed to a lack of vegetation along the riverbanks and not just trees. But I just think that we're at a stage where we're just trying to start this dialogue. So I mean, for trees, it's not to disregard any of the value of the other species or plants or ecosystem services, but I think it's kind of just going to be the catapult to get the conversation going on that level. In particular, in Freetown and Sierra Leone, because they have this massive mapping campaign and tree planting campaign where they're going to plant within the next year over 1 million trees. And they've already started right now with about 500,000 is on their way. It's to support their initiative to be able to have quantifiable data saying, yes, you planted trees, 5 years later, yes, 90% of them are still alive. And to kind of support the more sustainability aspects of not just planting trees, but growing them, keeping them alive until they reach maturity and they're well established. So yes, I'm really glad you mentioned that. There are definitely other plants and shrubs and greenery that are going to be integrated into projects, but we're not currently looking at mapping those as well. So we do have projects that have strategic guidelines and placement that'll be done for other greenery, especially in Tanzania, but it won't be a mapped situation. And the last question on the mangrove parts, absolutely, for the canopy cover, that will be fully included. And the hope would be in the future, and this is the dream, although Dar es Salaam is quite big, is to have every tree mapped and identified with a unique ID code in Dar es Salaam. So that was the pre-COVID dream. When field work was, I'm laughing because I see some other people laughing, when field work was still allowed. And so we're hoping over time to get a proper database and inventory for establishing something really new, which would be like an urban forestry management sector, which is yet to kind of exist in this space. So I hope that answers it a bit for you. We're just a bit behind, maybe. I know South Africa is quite ahead.
Well, I think COVID has really turned the chairs around on the deck for everybody. And I think, unfortunately, on this note, we're going to have to cut it short. There are still some questions. Some of them are quite technical. There are questions around testing Google delineation and some very specific questions around mapping of indigenous species, et cetera, which we will refer to our individual panelists and speakers. But I need to, unfortunately, now to say thank you to everybody. I think it's been a really great webinar. Mapping is not something that we often see as a topic in webinars, and yet I think it's an extremely important skill and tool. We've certainly in ICLEI, in the work that we've done, both in Dar es Salaam through the Interact Bio project, but also through many of our other projects across the continent, have seen the value of maps, for example, in the city of Johannesburg. But I also just want to say I thank you all individually and personally for taking your time out. I know that you all as panelists and speakers are all in your own right very busy people, and it's been great to have you share your insights and your knowledge and your experiences with us. And I think, you know, on the note of COVID, I certainly think that COVID and how the sort of post-COVID society and the impact on cities and the green recovery that people are talking of are going to place new challenges on mapping. And I certainly think, in listening to the innovation around the table this afternoon, that there's some amazing things out there, and that I look forward to maybe having a follow-up discussion around mapping and COVID maybe next year. So on this note, I want to thank everybody again, also our attendees. We've had a really lively discussion. And then just to say that you can find out more about our mapping work and some of the other work that you do if you visit our website. And we will have some more nature-based or nature webinars later on in the year, and we will certainly keep everybody up to date. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon and goodbye.